If your doctor told you to take a deep breath and relax, would you? In Hyde, England, everybody did. That's what made it easy. 215 death certificates, all signed in the same small, neat handwriting. At first, no one saw the pattern. By the time they did, the paper trail was longer than the graveyard fence line. Dr. Harold Shipman looked like comfort in human form. Cardigan. Spectacles. A gentle smile that said he'd heard this worry before and knew just what to do. He called his elderly patients "my dears" and remembered the names of their grandchildren, the birthdays, the anniversaries, the griefs that never quite stopped hurting. He'd stop in for tea, ask how the roses were doing, press 2 fingers to a wrist, and leave a small white slip that promised one more week of peace. When people died after his visits, families said, "At least Dr. Harry was there." That sentence became his camouflage. Hyde was a place where gossip never beat grief, and grief didn't question paperwork. Rain softened the brick and blurred the days together. People kept their doctors for decades. Death felt ordinary, until an undertaker began counting. Alan Massey, the local undertaker, had buried more of the valley than he wanted to remember. It made you quiet in a way that never quite went away. You notice small details, the way a jaw relaxes, the color that leaves fingertips, the cooling ring a cup of tea leaves on a saucer. Lately, those details weren't adding up. His hearse kept stopping at the same tidy, semi-detached houses, and always after Dr. Shipman's visits. The bodies were often found sitting up, as if someone had paused a life mid-breath. The television still murmured. The kettle clicked silently on an empty boil. "They're not dying in bed anymore," he muttered to his assistant one gray afternoon. "They're sitting up, watching the telly. It's like someone pressed pause." "Coincidence?" the assistant questioned. He meant it kindly, the way you tell someone a noise in the attic is just the wind. Massey started writing down names. After a month, the list filled half a page. After a year, 2. He slid those pages into an envelope and brought them to a local general practitioner, Linda Reynolds. She was the kind of doctor who asked twice how you were doing, because the first answer was never the real one. She took the envelope home, cleared a corner of the kitchen table, and started cross-checking. When the numbers settled, she put the pen down and just listened to the hum of her refrigerator, because the room had gone too quiet. Shipman's patients were dying nearly 10 times more often than anyone else's. She carried her notes to the coroner, John Pollard, a careful man who disliked conclusions that arrived before the evidence. He frowned at the stack of papers. "Odd," he said. He said it again, but softer. He sent a notice to the police. Somewhere a file opened. Someone read it. Someone closed it. Life has a way of forgiving the lies it wants to keep. The little inquiry ended with a shrug. The pattern went back underground. Shipman kept making house calls. There are moments, small ones, that open doors you can't close again. Angela Grundy didn't know she was touching that door handle the day a brown envelope arrived at her desk. She was a solicitor, practical and precise, a woman who knew where every key was and why each one mattered. Her mother Kathleen was 81 and briskly independent, the kind of woman who walked to market, scolded prices, counted change twice, and then gave half of it to charity anyway. She laughed often and loudly, the way people do who refuse to be old. Dr. Shipman visited one June morning in 1998. Kathleen offered tea because that's what you do when anyone comes to your door in England, and especially your doctor. He smiled. He said it wouldn't take long. She rolled up her sleeve, trusting the way you trust traffic lights and church bells and men in white coats. An hour later, she was dead. Shipman wrote old age on the certificate, signed it neatly, and told Angela her mother hadn't suffered. He spoke quietly in the hallway, like grief had to be handled with gloves. Angela nodded because that's what you do when authority speaks and the floor just tilted under your feet. She walked him to the door and watched him step into the drizzle. Something about the afternoon felt unfinished, like a sentence that failed to find the last word. She made tea she didn't drink, stood at the window, and tried to think of who to call. Weeks later, the brown envelope arrived. Inside, a new will. Every bit of Kathleen's estate, house, savings, the little stack of bonds she kept wrapped in a rubber band, left to Dr. Harold Shipman. Angela sat very still. She had drawn up wills and contested wills and knows when one is written in an angry hurry. She knew how grief changed handwriting and how greed changed it more. This signature was stiff, copied, too careful in all the places her mother's hand was careless. The language was cold. Her mother wrote like she spoke, plain with a little humor tucked inside. This had no breath. She followed the evidence. That's what her mother would have told her to do. She carried the will to the police, set it on the desk with both hands and said, "If he forged this, my mother isn't the first." Sometimes the truth arrives wearing boots and gloves in the half-light of morning. They exhumed Kathleen Grundy on a cold September day. Reporters waited behind cordon tape that snapped in the wind. Forensic pathologist Alan Williams directed a small army of steady hands. They recorded, measured, photographed, and lifted the coffin like it could break the world if they stumbled. At the lab in Leeds, the technician labeled vials with a pen that squeaked faintly against plastic. Formalin bit at the air. The toxicology equipment hummed. Numbers spilled out, precise as guilt. The concentration of diamorphine, medical heroin, was not therapeutic. It was more than enough to stop a heart in minutes. Not pain relief. Not end-of-life mercy. Deliberate. The needle marks were faint, tucked under a bruise that no one would have questioned at the time. Now, under a strip of white light, they looked like a set of initials you only learn to read in hindsight. Detectives searched Shipman's home. In a drawer, they found vials of morphine and controlled drug order forms in the names of patients who had long since been buried or burned to ash. On his computer, a file, K. Grundy Last Will. It blinked on the screen like a confession in plain English. They arrested him. He adjusted his glasses and said, "This is absurd." He said it like the world was being impolite to him. "I've cared for these people all my life." Maybe he believed that. Maybe he believed care included deciding when a life should stop. Detective Superintendent Bernard Posels opened the floodgates. Every certificate Shipman had ever signed was pulled from archives that smelled of dust and ink, and all the things you trust because they are boring. They matched signatures to prescriptions, prescriptions to pharmacy orders to the small gray boxes where morphine ampules wait for pain that's real. They mapped house calls against time of death, sorted names into a pattern that didn't care about how polite a man was. The picture forming wasn't a portrait, it was a blueprint. Same times of day, same drug, same doses at the high end of what anyone would call comfort. The same neat reassurance again and again, no further action required. He wasn't killing out of rage. Rage is messy. This was something tidier. A habit. A belief in his own quiet authority to decide who needed what and when they had had enough. Detectives started recognizing names. A cousin's neighbor. A woman who baked for the school fair. The uncle of the man who delivered their mail. One officer said later, "We realized we weren't walking into a crime scene. We were standing in one that had lasted 20 years. Other doctors began to speak, haltingly, like people learning a language they never wanted to use. They had wondered why he rarely referred patients to hospital. Why his cremation forms were so frequent. Why he handled so much of the paperwork himself. But you don't accuse a colleague without proof. You nod in corridors. You share jokes about the weather. You assume the best because the alternative is a life you don't know how to live. Proof filled boxes now, their cardboard sides about to burst, string biting into the lids. The case went to trial in January 2000 at Preston Crown Court. Families filled benches and clutched photographs whose edges had been handled too often. The pictures smelled faintly of old drawers and the lavender people put in them to keep moths away. Shipman sat very still in his cardigan, hands folded as if he were waiting to be called in for an appointment. The prosecution did not shout. They put numbers on screens and documents on easels and let science do the talking. The morphine residues in tissue samples. The prescription logs that pointed like arrows. The forged will that walked itself to the front of the courtroom and sat down in the witness box. Doctors testified to what therapeutic doses look like and what death looks like when it's meant to be gentle. This was not that. The defense denied. Denied the pattern, denied the intent, denied the forgery with a straight face and an empty mouth. The jury went out and stayed gone for 6 days. When they returned, everyone in the room had already learned the answer in the silence. Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment. No parole. He never confessed. He never apologized. He never explained. On his 58th birthday, he hanged himself in his cell. There was no note. No attempt at absolution. Just the last small decision left to a man who had been making them for other people most of his life. The inquiry that followed tried to count what could be counted. At least 215 murders, likely more than 250. The numbers refused to be kind. The pages stacked so high you could have used them to block a door. The conclusions were simple, the way hard things sometimes are. One doctor had exploited trust, systems had helped him do it, and people who should have asked questions didn't. New rules followed. 2 doctors to sign every death certificate, not one. Tighter controls on controlled drugs, digital ledgers that can't be quietly folded into desk drawers, algorithms that nudge human eyes when patterns go wrong. It all made sense on paper. In Hyde, the sense arrived late. Some families wouldn't let doctors visit alone for years. They booked double appointments, insisted on a nurse in the room, watched hands around syringes the way you watch hands around matches. Others changed clinics, unable to walk past the window where the kettle used to sit. The blinds were different now. The light fell in a new way. It didn't matter. Linda Reynolds did what was asked, testified, then tried to return to ordinary life. But ordinary didn't fit anymore. Each night she walked past the clinic's glowing windows and thought of the patients she'd never met, the ones she'd only counted. John Pollard reread his own earlier notes and learned how to dislike the word odd. Alan Massey kept burying people because the living still needed him to. Angela Grundy never moved back into her mother's house. Memory is a furniture you can't stop walking into. He stole her life, she said, and almost stole her story. She didn't let him have both. We like to imagine evil is loud. A glint of a knife, a shadow in an alley, something with a soundtrack. Harold Shipman smiled, asked about your sleep, and filled a syringe with calm. He didn't look like danger. He looked like safety. That's why it worked. Could it happen again? Maybe not this way. The paperwork is tighter. The drugs are locked up and counted like coins. The data watches from quiet rooms where computers hum and graphs lift their hands when something goes wrong. But systems don't save people. People do. And systems only work when someone cares enough to look twice, to make a note, to say the uncomfortable thing in the quiet room where everyone wishes you wouldn't. If your doctor told you to take a deep breath and relax, would you? In Hyde, everybody did. That's what made it easy. So the next time a kind voice says, "This won't hurt," you don't have to flinch. You don't have to doubt the person trying to help you. You just have to remember the town that trusted too completely and the people who finally learned to ask for a second pair of eyes. Because sometimes the monster doesn't hide in the dark. Sometimes he knocks on the door in daylight, smiles kindly and says, "Let's make you comfortable." And sometimes the only thing that stops him is a daughter with a brown envelope, an undertaker with a list he can't ignore, a doctor who refuses to be quiet, and a line of numbers that won't stop telling the truth. Science doesn't just heal. Sometimes it unmasks. And when it does, the whole town learns to breathe again, slowly, on purpose, this time with their eyes open. Thanks for being here. If this story kept you listening, hit like, subscribe, and share it. That's how I keep the next one alive. You can also explore my other series, Hero on the Scene and History on the Edge, real stories told on the edge of truth.